Howdy, Earth historians. The subject of this YouTube posting is biological evolution. Now, the reason to cover evolution in a course on Earth history is that the story of Earth is intimately woven with the story of life. Life either drives or is a part of many of the different chemical cycles, for example the carbon cycle, that determine environmental conditions at Earth's surface. As life has changed through time, so has Earth's surface conditions. Biological evolution is the study of how and why life changes through time, so understanding this subject is necessary for an understanding of Earth history. Now normally, I would assign a reading for a topic like this, but in my judgment, your textbook and most others don't do a very good job of covering evolution, at least not from the perspective of a modern understanding of Earth history. There's nothing actually incorrect or anything wrong about their descriptions, but the perspective they provide is somewhat outdated, and it doesn't illuminate an understanding of Earth history the way we would like to in a course like this. So, let's get started. For our purposes, I'm going to define evolution as nothing more than a change in a lineage through time. And by a lineage, what I mean is a succession of organisms that form a continuous line of descent in which each generation inherits characteristics, at least partially if not entirely, from the preceding generation. Here's what this means. Based on the fossil record, life has existed continuously on Earth for at least 3.4 billion years. All organisms are born from a previous generation of organisms. Every line of parent to offspring descent from the Archean to the present day is therefore a lineage. Life today is different than it was back then. In other words, it's changed. Therefore, change has occurred in lineages. And that's all I mean when I say the word evolution in the context of this course. Now, the scientist who is most closely associated with the theory of evolution is this fellow, Charles Darwin. Darwin essentially put the study of evolution on a scientific basis by bringing together an enormous amount of data, reproducible observations about the world, and providing a mechanism for how and why lineages should change from one generation to the next. In other words, he built a theory that created a framework for understanding the diversity, biogeography, and history of life. As you know, a theory is an accumulation of both observations and hypotheses, some well established and tested, some simply proposals and predictions of what we should expect in further data collection. It's not necessarily a complete or authoritative understanding, but it has the advantage of identifying actual gaps in understanding. And in the 1800s, when Darwin was working, there were substantial gaps in understanding that have actually been filled in subsequently. Now, Darwin's critical contribution, in addition to collating a huge amount of personal observation, was articulating what is usually called the principle of natural selection. Now you notice on this slide that I've labeled this as a law of natural selection. Recall that a law is a statement that is true by necessity. If the premises or assumptions that are being made are true, then the conclusion must be true by necessity. Now, the key to applying a law to understand nature, of course, is determining whether the premises are actually and in fact true. If they're not, then the conclusion is irrelevant. Darwin's law of natural selection is based on 4 premises. The first is variation, and it's simply a statement that within a population of organisms, individuals differ from one another. The second premise is the principle of heritability, and it states that much of this variation is heritable. By heritable, what I mean is that what makes any individual distinct from others in the population was inherited from its parents and can be passed on to its offspring. The third premise is competition. The resources things like energy, nutrients, mates, that are needed to live and reproduce are limited. This occurs because if resources are overly abundant, a population of organisms will continue to grow until pretty much they have used up everything, so there's no excess. Once there's no excess, in order for individuals to come into the population, they have to take resources away from individuals that are already in the population. In other words, because the resources are limited, individuals have to compete for them amongst one another. The fourth premise is described here as differential survival or reproduction. And it simply says that those individuals with variations that give them an advantage in the competition for limited resources will end up leaving more offspring in the next generation. Keep in mind, this variation has to be heritable. If their advantageous variation is in fact heritable, it'll be present in a larger proportion of the individuals in the next generation than in the current generation. Notice that this isn't just about individual survival, it's actually about reproduction. Certainly, if an organism can't survive, it won't reproduce. But many surviving organisms simply don't reproduce as successfully as others. So the next generation simply won't be the same as the present generation. And that's the core of evolution. Heritable change in a lineage through time. Now let me repeat again, this is a law because if a population has heritable variation and individuals are competing for limited resources, then natural selection is a necessary consequence of the way the system works. So now that I've laid out this basic theory, this basic formulation for natural selection, let's take a look at some of these premises. And we're going to start with the amount of variation that occurs in natural populations. Here's an example. These are 15 frogs from one population in South America, and even to us, as opposed to, say, other frogs, the differences in shape and color amongst individuals are pretty clear. For example, some of these frogs, like this one here, is more green. Others, like this one down here, are more brown. Some of them have very distinct stripes, like this one. Others have a very smooth color on their back. Their shapes are different. This one is quite a bit more sleek than, say, the one right above it, which is quite a bit more fat. Now, the critical thing for evolution is that these differences need to be coded into the genetic material of these individuals. Otherwise, there's no continuity from one generation to the next. Variation that is due to differences, something like early nutrition or what the animals are eating or ambient temperature, for example, may in fact be competitively advantageous at any one time in any one generation, but because they're not inherited, they won't result in a change in the next generation or the lineage down the line. Okay, that was just one example, but as it turns out, it's fairly easy to do the kind of natural history work that can document extensive natural variation in populations of all kinds of different organisms, both in terms of their just outright appearance all the way down to their biochemistry and genetic makeup. It's these differences among individuals that are the basis for differential survival and reproduction. And it's at this point that I'd like to make a rather subtle distinction here. The point I want to make is that, in fact, differential reproduction does not actually require competition or selection. Competition depends on hitting the limit of one or more resources. So what if a population is small and growing in a place with more than enough resources for every individual? There's an excess amount of all the necessary resources. Now, if some individuals have a trait that allows them to reproduce more quickly, not because they're a superior competitor for resources, but simply because they can simply produce more offspring per unit time, well, that trait will increase over time, but it won't be increasing at the expense of any of the other organisms. So let me walk you through this diagram as an example. In this case, let's pretend the little circles, the balls, are cells. And within the cells, there are alternative molecules that help them reproduce. There's the little black doohickeys and the little red doohickeys. In each generation, because of natural variation, individuals have different proportions of red and black. Now, if they don't have enough of either, then they die out. That's what's happened to this branch of organisms through here. But let's say that the higher proportion of red molecules you have, the shorter your generation time, the faster you reproduce relative to organisms with all black doohickeys. Well, the black doohickeys don't necessarily go extinct. They exist here at this later time, but they just form a much smaller proportion of the entire population. Now here's the point I want you to take away. Selection is often presented as synonymous with evolution. Now there's no doubt that selection is important. I'll discuss it in a few minutes. But it is possible for lineages to change through time without the operation of competition or selection. Selection simply isn't a necessity, and this is actually one of the bones I have to pick with most textbook descriptions, because they leave the implication that these two ideas are in fact the same, but they're not. And there seems to be evidence in the history of life on Earth that there are times when change wasn't strictly being driven by selection. You'll see what I mean as I continue to go through this podcast. So, selection may not be an absolute necessity for evolution to occur, but there's no doubt that it does actually play a critical role in real natural systems. So the first point I'm going to make regarding selection is that selection doesn't change individuals. It eliminates individual organisms from a population, and by doing so, it changes the characteristics of the entire population. Essentially, through differential survival or reproduction, selection ends up reducing variability in a population, and by doing so, it can shift the average of the population. Let me show you what I mean. So let's consider a population of beetles with a variety of different colors on their backs. This word here, phenotype, is simply an expression of what the organism looks like. So in this case, we've got something called stabilizing selection. It's the outliers, the things that are most unusual from the average conditions right here, that are suffering from the greatest degree of selection. They're the ones that are most likely to be eliminated or least likely to contribute to the next generation. So the result is, in the next generation, the genetic information that allowed these beetles to be light here or dark here has been eliminated from the population. If this continues, the degree of variation in the phenotype, in the color of the beetles, has decreased over time. The average color of the beetle hasn't changed, but its range of variation in the population has, and that's definitely a change in the conditions of the population and therefore evolution. Alternatively, we can have a phenomenon like directional selection. We're going to start with the same population of beetles of a variety of colors, except in this case, it's only the light beetles that get selected and eliminated from the population so they don't contribute to the next generation. As each of these light beetles is contributing less in each subsequent population, the average condition of the population becomes darker and darker. So even what was the dominant color initially has become a minor contribution to a later generation. Now, this sorting of existing variation in a population is what we're going to call microevolution. If this is all there was to evolution, the whole process would rapidly grind to a halt as virtually all variation within populations was simply selected out of lineages. Fortunately, that's not all there is to it. To balance the removal of variation by selection, there has to be another process that's adding variation to a population. And in the case of living systems, that process is mutation. A mutation is a change in the nucleotide sequence of the genome of an organism. In other words, it's a change in the DNA of an organism. Now remember, the information to grow and build and operate any living thing is stored in its DNA. Differences in DNA are the heritable variations seen among individuals in a population. If the DNA changes in a way that is not already present in the population, then that increases the total amount of variability in that population. Now, such changes can occur due to damage to the DNA of a cell, or it can occur during the copying process when DNA is replicated for reproduction, or geneticists have discovered in recent years that cells can actively induce change in their DNA in response to environmental conditions. The critical thing for evolution is that any such change occur in the DNA that ends up being passed on to the next generation. Now, it's important to point out that DNA is not the organism itself. Rather, DNA has to be translated into a protein in order to be expressed. Now, some of those proteins just function in one way, but some of them have a huge impact on the organization of a living body. So some mutations, they don't alter the protein at all. They have no noticeable changes. Evolutionarily, they've increased the genetic variation, but they're invisible to selection or competition. Changes to other proteins can result in fatal damage. This is the ultimate form of selection. There's no reproduction because the organism isn't even viable to adulthood. Some mutations cause minor changes, and these can have small selective value, or they can be changes that really don't make a difference in the function of the organism, and these are called neutral mutations because they don't have any selective effect. And lastly, there are mutations that change a protein that can fundamentally alter the structure of an organ or even the entire body of an organism. This has been studied extensively over the last 4 decades in a set of laboratory organisms. A classic organism is what we're seeing here in this picture. This is the common fruit fly. On the left-hand side through here is what your natural wild type fruit fly is expected to look like. On the right-hand side is a fruit fly that's had sort of a compilation of induced mutations, the genetic cause of which molecular biologists have discovered. So, for example, there is a mutation that changes the size of the limbs. You can see the legs on the right side are quite a bit smaller than the legs on the left side. There's another mutation that distorts and corrupts the wing like this. This is clearly not a useful flying organ. It should be like this. A really bizarre mutation here is what's happened to this antenna. This is what an antenna is supposed to look like. A single mutation can replace that normal antenna with an extra leg. This is a fundamental reorganization of the body plan of a fruit fly. These kinds of dramatic changes are what I'm going to call macroevolution. These are changes in a lineage due to the introduction of novel variations. By novel, what I mean is variation that has never been seen or been present before in that lineage. Now, you may have noticed in my description that variation in a population is actually a conserved quantity. The amount of variation in a population has an influx. This is what is generated by mutation, and it's got an outflux. This is what's pulled out and eliminated by selection. The amount of variation in a population represents the balance between the rate at which variation is introduced to a population and the rate at which it is eliminated from a population. Again, as I said before, I think this is a useful way to think about this, but it's not what's covered in standard textbook descriptions. Okay, so why do biologists and Earth historians get so excited about evolution? Well, primarily because it provides an explanation and a way of making sense of a huge amount of information about the world. So, for example, evolution helps us understand diversity. I'm going to describe diversity as simply the variety of living and fossil organisms. Now, as you can see from this enormous tree right through here, life is amazingly diverse. But what's remarkable about that, in addition to the variety of life, is that that variety isn't random. Living creatures fall into distinct categories that share characteristics. For example, you don't see animals with a lion's head, a goat's body, and a snake's tail. A monster from classical mythology. Or an animal with, say, a dog's body, bat's wings, and leaves sprouting out of its sides. Evolution explains why separate lineages are different and distinct. Namely, evolution predicts that life should be composed of distinct clades, groups of species that share a common ancestor. The more recent the last common ancestor, the more recent their evolutionary divergence, and therefore the more traits they should have in common. If we push this reasoning of ancestor-descendant relationships and similarity all the way back to the early Earth, the common traits of all living things suggest that all life on Earth shares a common ancestor. At the most fundamental level, we recognize three great clades called domains. They're depicted down here: the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukaryota. The distinction between these two, bacteria and archaea, was only made very recently scientifically, in the 1980s, with the advancement of technologies that could sequence the genomes of microbes. For many, many decades, these were lumped together as single-celled organisms called prokaryotes. We are examples of eukaryotes, and all large multicellular organisms on planet Earth are in fact eukaryotes, and they do some very different things, both as whole organisms and also within their cellular and biomolecular organization, from either of these other two groups. But it's the discovery of how to be a eukaryote that causes some of the most dramatic changes in Earth history, so we'll come back to this subject at a later point in the course. Now, another reason that biologists get excited by evolution is that it explains adaptation, traits that have a functional role in the life history of organisms. So, essentially, selection reflects the particular conditions in which a population finds itself. Individuals particularly suited to those current local conditions leave more offspring, so the population as a whole changes in each generation to suit those particular conditions. The classic example of this is referred to as Darwin's finches. This is a group of birds found on the Galapagos archipelago off the west coast of South America. Now, all of these birds are closely related. This is just a small subsample of finches on the Galapagos Islands. And what they've done on the island is divide up the food sources and habitats. So, for example, if you look at this image down here, some of them eat seeds, some of them eat fruit, some of them eat insects, some of them dig grubs. And as it turns out, each of these dietary habits, or these modes of life, is best suited by a different beak shape. Seeds need a beak that's robust and heavy that allows them to crush. Digging for insects in plants requires a narrow, much more sort of needle-nosed beak to spear them and dig them out of where they're hiding. This family of finches. These are all finches. These are all very closely related. There's only two genera, in fact. They're all very closely related to one another. But their beaks immediately identify what kind of food they like and what kind of habitat they occupy. Adaptation is an important concept to introduce because it fundamentally reflects how evolution operates to link life with Earth. Selection reflects those Earth conditions, other competitive organisms, but also physical conditions at the Earth's surface. And selection is how lineages respond to changes in the conditions of the Earth's surface. Selection drives lineage change through adaptation. Okay, so evolution is an enormous subject that can't really be fully explored in a short YouTube podcast like this. But what I've tried to do is outline the fundamental ideas that are most relevant and most necessary for understanding how evolution ties into understanding Earth history. Before I sign off, I'd like to close with a few final comments. So, first, I would like to remind you, evolution is about change in lineages. Although natural selection is an important mechanism of change, it is not in and of itself synonymous with evolution. And there may be extensive examples of evolution that are not driven by natural selection. Second, from an Earth history perspective, over which time is changing, it's important to remember that the different species of organism present at any moment in time, including the present day, are simply the expression of a changing lineage that was different in the past and will be different in the future, as long as it continues to leave descendants. Third, you can think of evolution as a two-part process, or an algorithm for a computer. Mutation acts to generate novel variation, and then selection acts to cut down the amount of variation. The important point here is that increasing selection intensity, in other words, times when environments get extremely difficult for life to survive, does not inherently increase the rate of evolutionary change, because what drives evolutionary change is not selection, but rather mutation. The last point that I will make is that evolution influences the next generation in response to conditions experienced by the present generation. In other words, evolution does not have the power to foresee or anticipate the future needs of a lineage. And from an Earth history hindsight perspective, this can result in remarkably short-sighted evolutionary solutions for a given lineage. It works in the immediate time that it forms, but it also sets up a lineage for ultimate extinction. But evolution can't tell that looking forward into the future. It only looks like that from our vantage point looking towards the past. Nevertheless, despite its lack of foresight, life has definitely changed through time and produced a remarkable variety throughout Earth history. And some of those evolutionary inventions that have been discovered through this process have literally changed the world. We'll see how as we continue our journey through Earth history.